Welcome to a special edition of WoWcast, where we're going to talk about a patch 11.1.7 feature, and then a broader discussion about add-ons in World of Warcraft in general. I'm Dratnos, World of Warcraft content creator.
Hi, Dratnos.
I'm Max. I'm the raid leader of Team Liquid, the WoW Guild, and a content creator as well.
And I'm Ian Hasekostas,
Hi, Max.
game director on WoW, and it's a pleasure to be here with you guys.
Very
Hello,
excited
Ian.
to be here. So what are we doing in 11.1.7?
A whole bunch of fun stuff, but one of the features that we're extra excited about is a new UI option that we're adding called Rotation Assist, which is really designed to help players who are maybe picking up a new spec or want some guidance on what abilities they should be using when, without having to turn to
So, okay, right off the bat, as soon as people hear this, Rotation Assist, the first thing you think of is the Hekili add-on, right? And this is going to be controversial because whenever anybody asks about Hekili in, class discords or my Twitch chat or whatever, we always immediately shut it down. We're like, no, don't do that. You're not going to learn your class that way. You're not going to get better. Having somebody just telling you what to press is never going to give you enough information for you to actually understand what you're doing, why you're pressing those buttons, why you're pressing them in that order. So it's interesting that now we're not going to have a way to prevent people from actually, utilizing something like this because it's going to be built into the game. It's going to be built in for any player from the start, all the way up to level 80 and, even beyond. Once you start getting hero talents and been doing higher end content, everyone's going to have access to this. So it's going to cause some problems, I can tell right away, because when the devs designed this, sorry, I'm kind of getting really deep into this pretty early on in this React, but when they design this, they're going to have to come up with their own APL for how a class and a spec works. So an APL is an action priority list, and that's what Sims use to figure out what rotation they use to finally calculate what their DPS is. So the devs are going to have to come up with their own APLs for all different specs, all different potential combinations of talents, because it's not just like, okay, Havoc Demon Hunter has one APL. That's not true, because there's going to be so many different combinations of builds that a Havoc can use. There's, an inertia build. There's a momentum build. There's a cycle of hatred build where I-beam is a lesser cooldown. There's essence break. There's non-essence break. So they're going to have to come up with all of these things, and they're going to have to put them in an order, a priority system where hopefully it's identical or somewhat close to what the community uses with their APLs. Because the APLs that we use for Sims, those are handcrafted, right? Those are put together by people to dictate what the rotation is going to be. So there might be differing opinions on like how a rotation should act out, how it should be played, in what order. Inevitably, that's going to happen. There's going to be differences. There's already differences between the APLs we use for Sims and for what is dictated or taught to people on Wowhead. If you just go look up a class guide on Wowhead, a lot of times the opener that's on Wowhead is different than if you go and look to see what a sim is doing. So inevitably it's going to be different, and there's going to be things that might not line up. People are going to get confused. They're going to be like, oh, well, the combat assistant's telling me to do this. Why is Wowhead telling me to do that? So I can see a lot of confusion happening from this, but let's keep watching.
third-party add-ons for it. So we've seen that, there's an add-on called Hekili that is very popular with a lot of players. We're basically building in a very similar version of that into the base UI that you can opt into.
I also wonder if they worked hand in hand with the developer of Hekili. I think his name is Hekili. I wonder if they worked with him to create this, because the fact that they even straight up name drop Hekili makes it seem like they kind of got clearance. They got the go ahead. They got Hekili's blessing almost. Because in a lot of cases, they would just mention a like rotation assistant add-on rather than just straight up naming what that add-on is called.
That will, no matter what DPS spec you're playing, highlight the recommended next ability given your current energy, what's going on around you, and so forth. One extra thing that we're also going to do, which maybe goes a bit beyond what the add-ons can do, is also have a one-button version of that, where there'll be like a keybind that if you just want almost an auto rotation, you can opt into that, and it will just automatically cast the next recommended ability in the sequence.
So that's the big controversy from all of this, is the one button macro for your entire rotation. So this is what it's going to look like on your bar. The keybind, the spot on your action bar is going to have this gold arrow going around. And that just means whenever you press that button, that keybind is going to swap over to the next recommended ability. So while this does seem incredibly powerful, it's not. And we'll see why in a minute. There's a lot of reasons why this isn't going to work for everyone. If you're doing any sort of competitive content, it will likely, in most cases, it will likely be a lot worse for you. And again, we're going to find out why in a second. But this is not like, going to unlock your inner potential. This is for the people who may have like physical disabilities where they can't, perform a true rotation all the time. It's more so an accessibility feature, I would say, or for people who just aren't interested in WoW combat. Like people who are mount collectors or transmog collectors, and they just can't be bothered to learn the rotation because that's not why they play the game. This is for them. But anyways, let's keep watching.
There'll be a small GCD penalty associated with that, but we want to make sure that this is for accessibility purposes, that it's there for people who maybe just honestly aren't interested in the gameplay of like mastering their spec. They want to explore Azeroth and experience the story, and the mechanics kind of get in the way of that sometimes. This should be for them. Ideally, this is not a tool where someone is like being told by their raid leader to stop trying to DPS manually and just turn on the one button mode to meet some DPS check.
I don't think it's about meeting a DPS check. I think it's about clearing up brain bandwidth so people stop dying. I could definitely see that. If there's a DPS who is a brain dead monkey and they keep dying because they're focused on their rotation, you could get the order from your raid leader to be like, hey, enough is enough. You keep dying. You're going to one button macro jail. You no longer have to do your rotation. Spam your one button and watch your feet. I could see that situation happening. If that's happening to you, then might need to take a good look in the mirror and get your shit together. But I could see that happening for sure.
That we want to give you the tools to kind of go through that organic progression naturally.
Great.
But the rotation assist doesn't come with a penalty or anything like that. That's just we're going to show you what your next button is.
Exactly.
Right.
It's very similar to the Hakili add-on. It's kind of reflecting, just the latest kind of established theory crafting, and it's something that we would continue to update, with spec changes and class changes over time. Ideally, it all's born out of the idea that we've seen a valuable tool that players feel like they should be looking outside the game to download, and we'd rather just reduce the barriers to that and make it available to everyone.
Okay, yeah, because there's two parts of it, right? Like the advanced is, I want to really go into this, is the one button thing, but that's not necessarily everyone that's going to use this. Like, I think this game, especially new players getting into it, there's a lot going on within a particular class, and you can be a little lost.
It's really good for
trying
new
to figure out
players.
Exactly what I should be pressing. So even just using it as like as a guide to start learning your class and move off of it eventually, but just having a base understanding of what actually should I be doing at a base level of this.
That's really exact.
I think that's a good, glorified, sentiment of how it's going to be used. But realistically, it doesn't tell you why you're pressing those buttons. So I don't know if there's necessarily any learning that's going to happen. Because you need to understand why you're pressing the buttons, because it's not always a locked-in rotation, right? You're not always going to be pressing your sequence of 8 buttons in that exact order all the time. Sometimes there's going to be things that you swap around, or if there's a mechanic that's about to happen, or you have to move out of something, you might hold off on pressing this button here because you need to press it somewhere else. So are you really going to be learning? There's so many interactions between all of your abilities. Like when you look at talents, right? And how a talent can affect so many different abilities, and 2 talents can work together to do something else. That all influences the order that you press your buttons. So I don't necessarily know if this is going to fulfill that purpose. It might. It might. I know for me it won't, because I tried to do that with, I think it was Windwalker Monk in Shadowlands. I tried to learn how to play Windwalker, and I was using something like Hakili. I don't know if it was Hakili or like Tell Me When or something, but I didn't quite understand why I was pressing things in that order. I was just like playing whack-a-mole, right? It was telling me to press this button, so I pressed it. Then it told me to press the other button, and I pressed it. But I didn't understand like what the setup was. Why was I pressing that button there? It was to get this buff, which is then going to help this other ability do something different. So we'll see. We'll see.
Get the motivation on our end. I mean, especially with warbands and War Within, we see lots and lots more alts, and leveling is pretty quick. You got a bunch of warband until equipped gear that you're passing over to a new character, and just jumping into their full rotation when you've never played the spec seriously before can be a pretty serious undertaking. And for some people, this may be enough for them, and that's fine too. But we recognize that there's so much. WoW has such a high skill ceiling that just recommending what the next ability is isn't going to really remove that or fully solve that. There's still the muscle memory that you need to form, and then all of the nuances of like, we might have a recommendation for a rotation that makes sense if you're fighting a target dummy, you're fighting patchwork, but when you need to plan around the fact that you're going to have to move in 4 seconds, that's a whole different layer of skill that still rests with players.
Yeah, I know when I'm trying to, play a new spec for the first time or haven't played it in years, it often feels like I've got like a 30-minute checklist of, okay, I got to set up my keybinds, got to make sure, oh, this ability's changed since 2 expansions ago, I got to rebind that. And
what he just described there is why I have such a hard time playing alts. Because I go through that, I load up my alt, I log in, and then immediately I feel like, okay, I need to do all these things. I need to fix my UI, first of all. Then I need to figure out what talents I should be using. Then once I have all my talents in, I have to see what abilities I now have, on top of the baseline things. And then I have to figure out, okay, where can I put those on my bars that's going to be the most efficient with my muscle memory, and how are they going to relate to the keybinds I've set up on Havoc? Sometimes it doesn't line up 1 for 1, right? Sometimes you have more or you have less. You need to create extra keybinds. And then you have to like learn the rotation too. You have to learn the rotation, and after all that, I get halfway through that process and I'm like, fuck, I could just be playing my Havoc and having fun doing that. So I definitely, I could see this being useful for that, for sure.
And then I got to go and read some guides and figure out how all my new rotation works, and here's how the new set bonus works. So I could see it being really nice to just have this is a way to jump into some content to do with your friends and have it work out nice and easily. One thing that jumps out to me is that
it also should be mentioned, this isn't going to work for tanks and healers. So I wonder what's going to happen if this gets turned on for those classes, if it's just not going to work at all, or if it's going to give you a very, very suboptimal result. I'm curious to see how they approach that.
That a lot of the content I'd want to do would be like delves or keys. And in either of those cases, there's a lot of AoE.
Yeah.
Is this going to have are we going to detect whether we're fighting 3 targets, 5 targets, and is it going to cast my Arcane Explosion instead of my Arcane Blast, or is it just always going to be a single target?
It's not just single target. There is, some sense of, how many enemies are within your range, in front of you, etc. And so that will affect the recommendations. Again, the goal is not.
That's a good feature that they're adding, where it's dynamic and it's constantly scanning for how many enemies are around you in combat. There are other things that do that. I know Hakili does that. There are weak auras that do that. but they're really resource intensive because they're constantly checking around you. So the fact that this is going to be happening server side, really good, really good. That'll clear up some resource. It just that, and like it is actually going to give you an accurate or a bit more accurate recommendation as to what to press. Like it's not going to be telling you to press your single target thing when you have a group of 8 mobs in front of you. But then this leads us to the other thing where it's like, okay, what if, even though we have 8 mobs in front of us, what if 7 of those are little shitter mobs that don't matter? And you really need to be focusing your damage on one big prio target. The combat assist is probably going to be telling you to just mass AoE, which causes problems, right?
Optimal. The goal is not like this is gonna, okay, everyone's always gonna get perfect parses and so forth going forward. But as a baseline, this should be, it should be useful the same way that many, many people find Hakili useful today. And really, like a lot of this building on the foundations of the cooldown manager that just came out in 11.1.5 kind of reflects us hearing people in the community telling us that they feel like they need to seek out these third-party resources just to play the game at like a baseline effective level in competitive content. And us asking, like, is that where we want the game to be in the long term? And what can we do to build in native solutions to many of these problems?
Like the base construct of it, there is a, this will help you learn what you're supposed to do if you are new. And then there is a, hey, I don't want to be the best player at this game. That's totally fine. I play it for a different reason. I want to collect things. I want to like understand the story. I want to quest. I want to level, right? And I don't want to feel like I can go into any content and I just don't really know what I'm doing. I feel anxious about that. Like you have the ability to just be like, okay, well at least Blizzard's got me. I can have something at a base level where I can press one button and just kind of hang out and play the game. I have one question.
The other thing, the one button macro, it does exist also. Like there are ways that you can get that. There's this thing called GCE. I forget what the acronym stands for, but I see videos for this all the time on YouTube where like you can download, I guess it's an APL that you take and you import into this thing, GCE, and then it gives you a one button macro. Isn't that an illegal add-on right now? I'm not sure if it's illegal because it is an accessibility thing and there are people who actually legitimately use it for that reason. But there are people who also use it for the wrong reason. But I guess the question is now, is it actually against TOS? Because now Blizzard is implementing it and they're explaining their reasons as to why. And they seem to be okay with those reasons. So has it really been illegal or against TOS all along? Who's to say? I don't know. But it is something you can do in the game right now. I've seen this one guy in particular, I forget his name, but he makes videos for every class and he gives you the APL for that class and spec. And yeah, you just press one button. Yeah, the main difference, I guess, between that and this is with this one, they're adding the GCD delay. So between every button or between every ability in your one button macro, there's a 0.2 second delay between your GCD. So over time, that's going to add up and add up and add up, which will be multiple GCDs missed over the course of an entire fight. So that's the main downside of using this. This is why it's not going to be viable for every single person to use. So just keep that in mind when you guys are like learning about this and maybe getting excited about this and thinking, oh, raiding is going to be so much easier now because I don't have to think. While that is true, you're probably going to be at the bottom of the meters and your team will hate you.
Question about the actual rotational thing. So is that going to like change with talent? So like, let's say, is it going to work off the base talent build, or let's say you select a talent that now moves a AoE button into your single target rotation? Is it going to be smart enough or plan to be smart enough to incorporate a bunch of different potential talent builds?
The goal is that it's aware of your talents and the logic is conditional based on what you do or don't have talented. As with, this is going to be something that continues to evolve. We may not have every single possible permutation accounted for in the version that we roll out with, but it should still be very useful in that form to everyone, and we'll just get refined from there.
Like my concern with this would be like, what if there was some scuffed build that had like, you know, a Fire Inside, Essence Break, Fell Barrage, and Glaive Tempest. I don't even know if that's possible, but you know, what if there was some strange combination that somebody decided to use? Is that actually going to work with this sequencer? That might be a bit too much. That's a lot of milestones or capstones to get. But you know what I'm saying, right? Like, if we take a Fire Inside, is it going to tell you to just like spam Immolation Aura and AoE, or is it going to spread them out? I don't know. Maybe I'm thinking about this too much. Maybe I'm getting too in the weeds with it.
There, similar to the cooldown manager that we know is like, that is a first take at this. We have plans to add much more customization, much more functionality to that over time as well.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's a really exciting feature individually. The thing that's most exciting to me is in the broader context of the cooldown manager, of all these other edit mode changes that have come out. You know, there was a time 5 years ago in WoW where if you were just getting into the game, there was an intimidating list of these are the add-ons that you need, and if you're not using these, you're kind of worse, right? Like you're noticeably worse. If you can't track your group member's major cooldown, right? Like you're worse at Mythic Plus than somebody who is, right? And it seems like the goal that has been accomplished with a lot of these things that have been coming into the base UI is you can use those add-ons if you want, but we now have a native way to the game that you don't have to get an add-on.
That is pretty much exactly our long-term philosophical goal here, right? Like, add-ons are amazing. The things that the community has done over the last 20 years to allow people to experience different aesthetics, different functionality, have information available at their fingertips, like, that is a huge part of WoW's success, and we don't question or want to undermine that for a moment. At the same time, like, as you said, ideally, it is about what do you want? How do you prefer to have things presented to you? And not what do you have to do? What is a group mate or raid leader or whatever telling you you must download? Or if you ask people, you know, hey, how can I get better? I'm really struggling at this. The first answer shouldn't be, well, download this add-on, this add-on, and this add-on. Otherwise,
my answer is download my Havoc Weak Aura pack. Download the Weak Auras add-on, then go to this other website, wago.io. Go in the search bar, type Jedith. You'll find a bunch of different Weak Auras there, but find the one that is the most up-to-date Havoc Weak Aura pack. Click on it, click on import code, then go into the game. Now you have that Weak Aura add-on that you just got. You have to go into your chat and type /WA, and that'll pull up a window. From there, it might be a little intimidating, but click on import at the top, and then you're going to paste in that code you got from the website. And then, after you do that, you're going to have all of these buttons on your screen. And from there, you're on your own. Okay, you figure it out from there. I can see how that would be very confusing for a brand new player.
as you're doing it wrong, because that's starting to get into that mandatory place, whether we like it or not. So yeah, I think, you know, longer term, these initiatives kind of fit into part of, you know, how we're thinking about the role of add-ons in WoW. You know, as we can probably all agree today, there is a sense that if you want to really be the best you can, if you want to play competitive content, there are certain add-ons that are required, that are simply going to improve your success over not having them, period. We would like to get away from that being the case. And I think I'd love to see a WoW one day where, you know, you can still customize the aesthetic look of your UI, you can have information and quest helpers and all the other things that you might want to have to make your experience a bit more seamless. But that at the end of the day, when you're in competitive content, when you're queuing up for a rated PvP match, when you're going into a high key, when you're trying to get a first kill on a raid boss, there isn't the sense that you are, you know, just holding yourself back if you're not using specific tools. We know that there's a lot of work to do to get to a place where that could be the reality. The first steps really are going to be continuing to build up the just right out of the box functionality that World of Warcraft offers to shrink that gap. But at the same time, I think we're aware that at the very end of this process, we probably are going to have to rein in some of the functionality that add-ons currently have to do like real-time in-combat problem solving specifically, where it's like automating coordination, communication in ways that are always going to be better
This
than
is important.
anything the UI can natively provide you as long as they remain possible.
Yeah, so that moves us into like raid bosses where I don't want to name any names, but there are people who have optimized a little bit of their own fun out of the game sometimes. I don't know where any of them might be sitting. They could be anywhere. They could be in this room with us.
Yeah.
Hey man, I am the like number one. Let's just YOLO this. Let's just do the fight. Let's make it work. And then sometimes it gets to let's try to make something that could be 95% successful, 100 or 99, right? And there's a lot of frustration with the tech involved with that. I would definitely be. I think a lot of the rating community would be pretty for that. You know, I think a well-designed mechanic.
I agree.
The game giving you enough information to solve this on your own realistically. A lot of the times the community will just use one because it's like what everyone else uses. It gets you in the same place. But if that doesn't exist and the game is giving you that information, it's objectively better, right?
And even if you are doing it very well, you know, manually, it's always going to be better to do it perfectly in a competitive situation. I mean, having watched, you know, your raid leading, for example, over many, many years over the race to world first, like years ago, you would call much more stuff verbally.
Very
like
true.
going back to, you know, Legion, BFA era, whereas nowadays it seems like if there is something you're calling repeatedly on attempts, the first thing you're doing is asking if, hey, can we automate this and get me out of the business of talking, which seems like it might be less enjoyable for you as a raid leader.
Yeah. Oh, I mean, if we're talking about that, I could talk all day about that. Yeah. No. I mean, I felt like you certainly had more of an impact when you had the ability to, you know, influence the fight more. But the reality is just getting some way to automate it for your players is just better. You know, it is funny. Like when I do that now, I think, you know, what else can I be doing with my time? I could be like looking at other ways to optimize, and it's purely for the sake of getting better. So yeah, for my own enjoyment, yeah, that's sweet. Let's do that. I'm trying to wonder also about those kind of mechanics. So like what bosses have existed in my head, I think in the past couple of years, there's not many, but have been defined by when we're progressing this boss, we feel like maybe we're progressing a weak aura.
Some major ones
something
recently.
like Brood Twister or Echo of Neltharion or Jailer maybe was one of the first ones, right? And those mechanics, I feel like could not have been done or probably would have been nerfed without weak auras or having that effectiveness of that reduced. What do you do as a fight designer now? Do you I know you're obviously like really passionate about raiding. You've raided for a really long time. What do you have to avoid those kind of assignment mechanics? Are there things in game you can use to like naturally sort out those?
So yeah, before we get further into this, just to explain what they might be talking about here, if you might not know. A lot of bosses in the recent past have had mechanics that are most easily solvable with an add-on that essentially just does it for you, right? So on Jailer, there was an overlay add-on that would come up and like tell you exactly which hole to jump in. With Lords of Dread, there was a weak aura or a macro, I forget which, it was probably both, that allowed you to figure out very quickly who was the person you needed to kill. When you all got like mind controlled, there was a very specific person you had to kill to get out of the phase. Echo of Neltharion to assign where each bomb person was going to go to what wall. There was a mini map that would come up for that. Farak, yeah, like a lot of these bosses had the only way, well, not the only way, but the best way and the most efficient way to solve a mechanic and deal with it was to use these weak auras or add-ons that just straight up told you where to go. And, you know, ultimately, a lot of people will say, hey, that's good because we get the mechanic done and then we don't have to think about it. But that's not what the point of raiding is. That's not why these mechanics are put onto bosses. They're not put there to just be completely mitigated by an add-on or a weak aura. Like, they don't design bosses that way. They don't put a mechanic on a boss thinking, hey, the only way that they're going to have to deal with this is some big brain is going to have to make up a weak aura. They don't do that, and they don't want that. And realistically, we don't want that either, because there's a lot of problems that come with that. There's a lot of, you know, inconsistencies with weak auras, and there's a lot of actual, like, what's the word I'm looking for? Customizing in a weak aura to set up a list to say, like, okay, this mechanic has to go to these specific people. There's things that can go wrong. People have the wrong versions of these add-ons and these weak auras, which can cause inconsistencies between players. Then you spend half the raid troubleshooting that problem rather than actually just progging the fight. And then, yeah, on top of that, a lot of them are very resource intensive when it comes to your computer and your FPS, and just the more things that are happening on your end at the same time, the less performance you're going to get out of the raid or out of the game. So, and for a lot of people, their FPS is directly correlated to their performance in raid. Like, I can attest to that myself. I know if I start losing a lot of frames in raid, everything feels sluggish and it starts to just feel off, right? As a very quick, a very high APM DPS class, I'm very used to a certain pace, and you get used to a rhythm of something. And as soon as that rhythm changes ever so slightly, the whole thing feels off. Your GCDs start to feel different. The whole tempo of everything is different, and that can affect your DPS massively. So long story short, what they're saying here is they want to avoid that happening in the future. They want to take away some functionality of weak auras, of add-ons, which will then kind of force Blizzard to actually design mechanics for raid fights that aren't going to require that are going to be a bit more, solvable by actual communication in your raid, or like just coordination in terms of movement, that type of stuff.
Those things, like, do you give more time for the mechanics? Like, do you have to stray away from assignments in general because the community has just, whether you like it or not, has like trained themselves to have something solve that for them? Do you have to like go back into like a more simple version of that? Do you find other ways to make fights difficult? There's obviously a bunch of ways to do that.
The way we design encounters has been influenced in significant ways by the way players use add-ons. I know, the community sometimes
This is what we just talked
speculates
about.
that, this was built clearly to require an add-on. I can say that's never the case. No encounter designer is ever sitting around saying, all right, we're going to make this mechanic, and then players will write this weak aura to solve it this way. All right, mission accomplished, let's ship the boss. But when we're thinking about the overall pacing of a fight, the tuning, we might get feedback on a fight that it feels like there isn't enough going on, when in actuality, there are 4 or 5 mechanics going on, but add-ons are largely compartmentalizing and making it so that most players don't have to think about them most of the time. And then players give us feedback that, hey, this fight felt a little bit slow, like I was just punching the boss for 3 minutes. And so then maybe we add another mechanic in the next iteration of that, or a similar encounter. We get to a higher overall complexity space.
So it's a catch-22, right? We're simplifying the mechanics on bosses, and because we're simplifying them for ourselves, it feels like there's not much going on, and the fight becomes a lot easier. So then Blizzard has to go back and add more mechanics on top of what we're already dealing with, the ones that are getting solved instantly by these weak auras, and the mechanics just keep piling up and piling up and piling up, and eventually you get to a point where you have too much happening at once, and it just becomes an absolute clusterfuck. That's why swirlies on the ground are on every single fight, because it's like one of the last things that Blizzard can do when they're designing a fight to add a bit of difficulty. It's one thing that like they can just throw into the mix, that just bumps up the level just a little bit, and that's pretty much all they're able to do. Their hands are tied, because everything else that they could potentially do or put into a fight could be solved by a weak aura.
Where there's just, you look at the dungeon journal and you're scrolling and scrolling and scrolling, and maybe half of it doesn't even matter because add-ons are going to handle it for you. I think that's not a great place for things to land. It also definitely ties our hands in some ways. Like, I think we do fewer coordination mechanics than we used to. Like, there used to be, like, if you look at old school WoW days, there were encounters where, like, the primary challenge for your raid was by design coordinating some rotation. And the execution beyond that wasn't super complicated, but making sure that this thing stayed soaked, or that you were rotating people through with their debuff or whatever, that became a big part of the fight's challenge. Now we know ultimately that that can never be the thing that we lean on for challenge, because it's going to be solved, and it's not going to be solved through what we think of as the more just interesting MMOE, like communication, cooperation, figuring out systems for having these things work in a way that feels collaborative. It's going to be downloading the weak aura pack, setting it up appropriately, maybe having 3 or 4 frustrating wipes because there was a typo in the configuration, that's not what I think anyone really wants raiding to be. And so we move away from making those mechanics as much, and lean more on things that add-ons can't solve for you, like moving out of a swirly under your feet with only a little bit of time to respond. Like, I don't think it's a coincidence that more and more of our fights have those sorts of just like twitch reaction, avoidance mechanics, whereas that used to be one type of fight that we did. The design space is definitely constrained by the knowledge that, you know, if we lean on it too heavily, it's just going to get trivialized.
Some of my favorite WoW raid boss memories are bosses like Mythic Unat, Mythic Anduin. You know, you have to spread out and then you get these marks and you have to go to the right places. And there used to be definitely a library of mechanics like that where you would get them and then you'd have to think and you'd have to have like a system and you'd have to have 20 players sort of coordinate and become one team that does.
Those types of mechanics are super rewarding to do. They take a little bit to figure out with your raid team, but once you start actually nailing it, it's so fun and rewarding to actually like move as a team, and you know, everyone just knows exactly what to do and you're coordinated like a little army. It's super rewarding to do that. And a lot of those types of mechanics, I know this might turn off a lot of people to say this, but a lot of those types of mechanics are what Final Fantasy bosses are. Those are I would say they're like the complete opposite end of the spectrum, where everything in the Final Fantasy XIV raid bosses is like a dance, right? It's all movement, it's all coordination. So I'm not saying it has to be exactly like that, but incorporating more of those things, I think would do a lot of good for the game. And like we just said, it would open things up for them to not have to artificially boost the challenge and difficulty of a raid boss solely by just adding swirlies. They would have other ways that they can actually do that.
A mechanic like that, and the fact now that add-ons take on much of that job of coordinating us, I think that almost all the Mythic Raiders I know would be delighted to move back to a world where we did that in our brains, right? But in Dragonflight, we saw a little bit of an attempt to make that happen, right, with the private aura system. And what ended up happening was we still had the weak aura, but now we also have a macro that we need to press, and then the weak aura will assign us the same thing. So
Zuso, thank you for the tier 1.
Worried, how's the arms race between the, you know, the weak aura devs trying to come up with a new way around the restriction that you're putting in? Is this just a further escalation in that?
Hopefully not. I think our goal here is kind of disarmament and definitely not further escalation. I think we understand that if we, you know, we're not going to try more little targeted things like that are going to encourage workarounds, and it just ends up with this back and forth. Because yeah, if there is a way to solve a complex.
So what I'm getting from this is they're saying, you know, we tried a light approach with private auras. They tried it, and again, we just found a workaround, and you know, we're just dealing with it in a more complicated way, I guess. What I'm getting from this now is that they're going to go all the way. They're just going to say, hey, this is our stance. We're drawing a line, and this is what it is from now on. So I feel like they're not going to be doing little changes here and there. It's going to be a big just line drawn in the sand where, okay, this is what's allowed. This is what we're blocking. This is the information you guys aren't going to be able to pull from for your weak auras and your add-ons. Which I think is the best way to do it. Honestly, it's going to disrupt a lot of things. It's going to upset some people, but it's the only way that they can actually make this a thing for good. If they keep doing little changes here and there, people will find ways around it. There's always a way around.
Complex mechanic, but you have to jump through a couple of more hoops to do so. You'll do that, and then just be more annoyed by the process. Our goal is to try to, you know, get out of that space entirely. And so I think down the line eventually, that may mean, I think, you know, some broader restrictions on specifically what information add-ons have access to about combat events in real time. At the same time, we know that that's not a thing that we could just do right now without providing a lot more on our end, both in terms of, you know, just UI type functionality, but also looking at how we're designing some encounters, how some of our classes work. You know, I think there are tons of add-ons that are.
That's very true. A lot of things need to change if they're going to do that. A lot of class design has to change. A lot of UI elements, like I think nameplates, 100% have to happen before they can make that big change, before they can rip that Band-Aid off. Nameplates need to be fixed. Because that is, I would say, the one element of the UI that's falling behind the most. Compared to everything else that they've started changing, the nameplates are the weakest point. So I think before they make that big sweeping change where they just limit everything that add-ons and weak auras can see, they need to fix those things. And even just class design. I think class design needs to be reined in a little bit in terms of complexity. And not even just complexity, but maybe like how many things need to be tracked at one point and how we track them. Because having to look up in your buff window or your buff bar to see certain buffs that you have, and they're short duration buffs. So where they're placed on your buff bar is constantly shifting. And I think they're trying to remedy that with the new what do they call it? The cooldown manager. But again, they need to add some more customization to that, where you can choose what you want to track. Because right now it's just it's kind of told to you what you can track, rather than being able to choose what you want to track and how you want to track it.
Healthy and valuable and really important to how players play the game that do rely on that flow of information. Everything from something as simple as damage meters to, like, you know, honestly, boss time, like ability timelines, like the DBM style, like when is this next ability going to fire, that people have basically been raiding with forever. Mm-hmm. That's not the like computational weak auras. That's just, hey, this ability is going to happen in 15 seconds. Like, we want to build in our own version of that. Like, I think like down the line, we'd love to see a play.
That's really encouraging to hear, right? They want to build in their own DBM, their own boss timers. And it's not an unheard of thing. Like, if you look up a game like Fellowship, they did exactly that. And they even called it DBM, which I don't think they were allowed to do. But they have their own boss timer system in the game. And I think that's a great idea. You know, it gives you so much information that you need to successfully do a boss. Because if we didn't use DBM, how would they be like, how would we as a raid team be parsing out when things are going to be happening? Are we sitting there with a fucking stopwatch? You know, like, the boss timers are so crucial to being able to do a fight, that I think, yeah, they would be pretty dumb to not include that in this whole like reworking of their UI. So that's really, really cool to hear that they're going to be putting in their own boss timers, assumedly for every boss in the game. That's sick. I'm excited for that.
Place where there is a boss timeline as just part of the encounter UI, and that's not something you need an add-on for. And that way we can hopefully eventually get to a point where we're really just cutting out the weak aura that solves the mechanic for you, but not the informational stuff that you feel like, It really feels like the game should have been telling you all along, where add-ons are, admittedly, you know, kind of filling in some gaps there.
Okay, so coming in 11.1.7, we're going to have the rotation helper, those two options. What of the rest of this initiative, is any of the rest of this in 11.1.7, or are we just starting the conversation now?
I think there's a lot of stuff that we're working on. I think, yeah, we've seen the cooldown manager and then the rotation assist coming. I think down the line, it's some of the stuff that I touched on. I don't have specific patch dates right now, but we are looking at damage meters. We're looking at nameplate improvements. We are looking at, you know, like a raid encounter information presentation that shows you timeline of boss ability.
So they're working on their own version of damage meters, right? So their own details. You won't have to go get an add-on for that. That's going to be baked into the game. They're working on new nameplates. So hopefully, if they do it well enough and they add some customization, maybe, you know, whitelisting, blacklisting buffs that you can track. If they do that, if they make it good enough, you won't have to use Plater. You know, they're going to include boss timelines. You won't have to use DBM. You won't have to use bigwigs. This is exciting. This is exciting. The main concern is, will they do it well enough that it can be a replacement for those add-ons? That's the big question. Because as of right now, the cooldown manager is not quite good enough to replace a class weak aura pack. It's not quite there. But they did say that it is just the bare bones of it, and they fully intend to iterate on it and improve it over time. So I would expect to see even more versions of the cooldown manager in 11.1.7. Obviously a lot more in 11.2 for the new raid. I think they're going to try to get a lot of it sorted out before then. So yeah, I guess in the distant future, all of these things will be implemented and hopefully iterated on enough that it can replace all of these other add-ons.
Abilities coming up, things in that general space. I think we're looking at all the places where players say right now, you need this weak aura, you need this add-on to be competitive, and asking ourselves, like, how do we change our game to make that not the case? And some of that's going to be add-on functionality, or UI functionality. Other aspects are going to be looking at how we're building some encounters or how some class mechanics work. Like, I think it's super fair to point at some specs, like let's say Outlaw Rogue, who I know are easy one to pick on in some of these ways, and ask, like, how is anyone really supposed to execute this perfectly with the base UI? Almost any time we're tracking like stacks of a buff, and you need to make a decision where it's like, if you're between 4 and 7 stacks, you should do this, otherwise don't. Those are not reasonable tests for us to be posing to our players without providing them the information to do it correctly. And so we need to either provide the information, simplify the mechanic, or both.
There are a lot of players who love the version of Outlaw Rogue that it has existed over the past few years. So I think there's always some fear when this discussion starts up of, is the answer going to be to simplify everything? And I think it's really exciting to hear instead that the answer is, okay, we'll maybe simplify some of these huge outliers, but we're going to bring in the functionality that makes it so that instead of needing to download a weak aura to solve this, right, instead of needing to have a complicated assistant tell you, now you're supposed to press this button, now you're supposed to press this button, instead we're going to provide that information in a more clear way than...
Yeah, so you don't want to simplify the class to a point where you don't need any help whatsoever. But you also, if something is super, super complex and kind of ridiculous, then yeah, they're going to pull that back a bit. But ideally, the way that issue is going to be solved is just having the information provided to you in a clearer, more concise way, rather than having to pull back the mechanic and make it just completely trivial.
Looking at the top right of your screen to see your buffs and trying to catch the rotation buff between all the other 20 that are changing in combat.
That's definitely the goal. I think we want World of Warcraft to be as approachable as possible, but we also love that the skill ceiling in the game is as incredibly high as it is. That allows for tons of differentiation and self-expression and accomplishment. But I think a lot of, at its core, a lot of skill in WoW I think boils down to multitasking ability, and like even just you might be able to do amazing damage just testing it against a target dummy. Very different world when you're also in an encounter and need to do 3 mechanics at the same time. And we see, tunnel visioning DPS are a meme for a reason, right? They're just focused on their rotation and whoops, they just messed up the encounter mechanic, or vice versa. Someone who is good at mechanics, but their DPS goes off a cliff. Really, like, the function of a lot of these add-ons is to offload a portion of that computational complexity. And we recognize, like, if we are removing some of that functionality, we're providing more information, we can probably remove a couple of mechanics, but still keep the same level of challenge. The goal is not to make it easier. The goal is to make it less complex. And I think that's, I think it's a key distinction there, because I think it often can sound like, oh, this is about, this might be about dumbing down the game or simplifying things. It's not that. It's about trying to create a more approachable baseline experience that still has every bit as much room for differentiation.
When you were talking about add-ons that things have been in the game, been inspired by it, you mentioned a damage meter.
Yeah.
So I'm really interested in just what your view is, philosophy-wise, about damage meters in games like this.
That's a great question.
This is very, very important because games like Final Fantasy XIV, they've taken a hard stance on this themselves, right? They have said, hey, we don't want any add-ons. We disagree with the concept of damage meters because it encourages a toxic environment in groups and in raids and just in, the way that people compare themselves to each other. So this is very, very important because this is where WoW is going to differentiate itself from a game like that, where they're not just, giving people the go-ahead to use damage meters. They're going to fully embrace it and bake it into the game. So this is wild to see.
And I think ultimately we have to be guided by what our community prefers and what we see them doing today. The single most popular add-on used across the entire game is a damage meter by like a fair margin.
Okay.
The majority of players, the large majority of players, have a damage meter add-on installed. And so that indicates that people want to see that information at least about themselves. We definitely want more nuanced measures of success and understanding, like how successful were you or how much did you contribute on this run, highlighting things like interrupts, highlighting things like avoidable damage to give a fuller.
That would be cool. So if you go through a dungeon, right? You do it like a key with a group. And instead of at the end of the dungeon, all you have to look at is the damage meters, the overall damage meters. What if it gave you a synopsis of how many successful interrupts everyone had, each individual person, how much avoidable damage they took, you know, how overall damage, of course, how many maybe like external cooldowns they used for their team. There's a lot of different things that they could highlight, and all of them are actually important to the success of a key, but people don't actually look at it. All they look at right now is the overall damage and who is on top. That's all anyone ever focuses on. So if they can bake this into their details, or sorry, not details, their damage meter system that they're going to put into their UI, if they can have like a, you know, at the end of a battleground, when you finish and the big window comes up and it shows the list of people, how much damage they did, how many kills they got, something like that. Something like that. That would be really cool.
Picture of performance, but at the end of the day, you know, I think for someone who's trying a new spec, trying a new talent build, getting a new trinket, and they want to see like how did this affect my performance compared to the last run, that's an important piece of information to have. And so I think, you know, we know that in any world where we were going to limit some of the ability of add-ons to, like, again, do that real-time combat event tracking, we would need to provide a damage meter solution of our own. And I think one of the exciting things is, I think if we're doing that on our end, we can also have it be server authoritative, so you're not worried about like who's in a different combat phase, who's out of range or whatever. Yeah. It could just be like, this is official and going to be accurate all the time.
We're obviously mostly
True.
thinking about Mythic Raid when, our brains go to how this is going to affect things, but the overwhelming majority of players are in, you know, heroic raids, normal raids, raid finder raids, doing Mythic Plus dungeons, right? When we're talking about making these changes to what WeakAuras can do, is there an appetite for changing how heroic and normal raids function as well? Like, do we see these problems in there as well for what add-ons can do and how they solve things?
Absolutely. I mean, I think it all trickles down, right? I mean, I think maybe even more, a larger percentage of players doing Mythic Raid might use specific WeakAura packs than, let's say, normal. But those add-ons are used by the majority of players right now, and certainly other, you know, boss mods are as well. And I think a lot of it just comes down to, you know, what are the coordination challenges that we're presenting? If there's something that everyone is relying on a tool right now to assist with, we would have to change it to still keep it the same level of challenging, but, you know, without that same automation assistance. And that can take many forms. It can be there's one or two fewer things to soak. You have an extra couple of seconds to like actually spread out on the fly. You know, it's a pretty common mechanic of like, all right, 3 people get a debuff and they just have to like run out in different directions from each other. People have been just kind of playing the game and doing those for years and years. But of course, if you can like, if the time you're given to react is so tight that you can't afford to do that,
right,
then people do gravitate towards, all right, we're going to put diamond, circle, and triangle on the ground. Everyone's going to get an auto-assigned marker, and you just know, like, I'm going to run to my marker to guarantee.
Like Ovanax eggs. Ovanax eggs is like the best example of that, right? There's, on Mythic specifically, there's certain eggs that 2 people have to run to. I think there's like four different eggs, and you need 2 people to go to each egg, and these 2 people specifically get a debuff that they need, or a bomb type of thing that they need to drop on top of this egg. The best way to solve that, to just not have complete chaos, was to put down markers and have a WeakAura auto-assign each player to go to a marker. And it just completely trivializes that mechanic. Like, obviously people are still going to fuck it up because there's other external things that can get in the way, but the fact that that is how you do that mechanic is kind of ridiculous.
Guarantee that it's executed correctly. I think it's a bit more interesting if we give you a couple of seconds so that you can look around and make sure you're not running in the same direction, and then do the exact same thing. I mean, at the end of the day, you know, raiding in particular, but, you know, group PvE, group PvP too. Like in an MMO, a huge portion of, I think, the fun of it is just coordination, communication, feeling like everyone's working together to overcome some challenge in front of them. And I think getting back into a space where there's room for more of that organic collaboration, as opposed to it just being like regimented and solved by an external tool, I think it, like, will open up a lot of design avenues for the game going forward.
Throughout the last couple years, especially in Mythic Plus, that had been ramping in complexity, you've seen, and actually even if you can go back, like, you can see the amount of things that people have in their UI to help them know that something's happening. So like back in Power Auras, it was, there was just some giant, some giant face on your screen would pop up, and that meant that something procced. And then it's gotten more, refined. And now, even in the last, it's been ramping the past couple of years. You see, like, you listen to someone's POV who's doing High Mythic Plus right now. You're going to hear AOE, dodge, frontal, circle.
Yep.
Like,
That's me.
it's just every bit of audio aid they've used to, it's in the idea of being optimal. It's not required. And especially this patch, I think Mythic Plus complexity has actually gone down as an intentional design point, it seems, at least. I think you might have made a post about that. So that stuff is less required, but people have like kind of already baked on the UI. Is that something that you're looking to either have an ability to have that in the game, or is that something you don't want to have happen, where it's more like you're organically doing mechanics because you see them, or are you okay with all of the audio and visual aids that exist currently within add-ons?
I think the answer is mixed there. I think like audio prompts are something that are super valuable to people. That's something we want to.
They should put audio cues into the cooldown manager. If you want to use them, if you don't want to use them, you can just uncheck the box. But give us a box to check, and then a drop down of different, sound effects that are already built into the game. You don't have to go and download anything else. You don't have to get like voice packs or anything. But you can just like assign one to one of the cooldowns that you're tracking. I think it's 100%. I would say they're going to do it. I think they even say it in here. But yeah, it's cool that they can keep taking these things that players have, tried to use to solve problems on their own, and they're like, oh hey, I see this weak or this add-on's doing that. We can do it better. They don't always do it better, but they try.
Continue to add support for on our end as well. Like, we know we've got feedback we've gotten around the 11.1.5 cooldown manager would be that many people would appreciate being able to have audio prompts tied to certain things or procs firing, and that's something they would miss about weak auras. We want to make sure that we're offering that kind of thing as well. Beyond that, I think a lot of what we've seen is, frankly, us not doing a sufficiently good job of telegraphing the importance of certain mechanics and their impact, and players needing to come up with solutions for them externally. Ideally, there's a concept that we call affordance, which is basically just how well is something telegraphed, how intuitive is it with visual presentation, and ideally, the affordance of a mechanic should match its impact. And sometimes, if you have a random mob in a dungeon pack that has a frontal that will just delete you if you're not getting out of the way of it, and it's just one thing going on among a half dozen other things, why? And why? Like, how could we call that out better with visuals, with a longer cast time, with how we're creating the pack in the first place? And that's just one example of one of the areas in which we know we can do better. Something else we've talked about on the UI front is we would want the ability to, on our end, flag mob casts in Mythic Plus as like lethal, as like this should be a high priority interrupt, because we know players are going to basically look to solve that anyway. If there are 3 casters in a pack, and 2 of them, it's actually kind of okay.
As of right now, the only way they can do that is through the actual like telegraph or visual representation of that spell cast in game. They can't do it on nameplates because we use replacement nameplates. But maybe in the future, when they do put in their own adaptation of better nameplates, they can do something unique with the nameplates themselves, whether it's color coding or putting a different frame on a mob, either just all the time or when it's casting. There's a lot of different things that they can do. But right now, they're kind of limited to just the actual graphic and the visualization of that enemy.
Okay to let them free cast, but one of them, if they ever get a cast off, you're probably going to wipe. They shouldn't all just look indistinguishable on your screen and us expect you to figure that out on your own.
They did that in season 1, right? Wasn't there like a couple casts or like super giga you die death volley or something?
Yeah.
And they had this big animation.
Our Kara casters where they hunker down, there's green glowy stuff around them, and they're casting a volley, and you're like, all right.
Yeah, exactly that.
You can be playing WoW for 2 days, and you're like,
That's not happening,
that can't happen. Yes.
But I'm looking forward to an M+ then, where if we're talking about maybe taking away my ability to air horn myself on on a certain cast, something like that.
To
if
air
instead I
horn
have to be now
myself.
looking at a mob and there is a sort of a visual language that I can come to expect, like if the mob is hunkering down and it's got particle effects around it, that means I got to kick it. I think that would be more fun for everybody as well, rather than having the air horns be the solution.
Definitely.
That is entirely our hope, right? I think, and to be super clear, I think we see the taking away part, the restricting functionality, as the end of this long road. I think we know, we want to make it very clear, we're not sitting here being like, all right, we want you to play the game the way we intended, and we're going to take away your tools. We just want to bridge that gap. And we have a lot of work to do on our end to keep building up more improvements, more functionality. And it's not just the UI. The VFX changes that you mentioned are a part of that overall effort of us asking, what are the places where players feel like they need add-ons to succeed? Why is that the case? And when it's like, it's not clear when you're standing in something, and so I need, GTFO or some other, sound effect to let me know that I'm standing in something lethal, it should be obvious. Let's fix that on our end. And we know
Exactly.
we want to keep chipping away at those things and hopefully eventually get to a point where really the only difference between what we are offering and what powerful add-ons can do is that small subset of like computational problem solving stuff, at which point we can move forward.
So throughout the evolution of private auras, we've seen, initially when they came out, they were like kind of, a lot of friction was involved. And then I think they were done really, really well in a couple of cases, starting in Emirdrasil, where they were a mechanic like P1 Fire Act. You had the circles you had to quickly spread out for. They were pretty fast, but they were too fast to use a macro for it. And it basically forced the players into something they would have used a weak aura for, to just do the mechanic normally. And like, are there lessons you've learned there of like, this is actually how we can design mechanics or kind of assignment things going forward? And then also, is this, if done successfully, would this also remove private auras as what would have been, I guess, kind of a temporary solution to the weak aura problem?
Yeah, we've definitely learned a lot from how private auras have rolled out. Certainly we understand that if we're ever using it on something that like is on a long enough time frame that macros are going to let you solve it and it's punishing enough to not solve it, all we're doing is creating an extra annoying hoop to jump through.
Exactly.
And we like hot fixed off the private aura designation from some of those back in Emirdrasil, and we've let that shape how and where we use or don't use it going forward. And so yeah, I think examples like the Furak mechanic that you mentioned are ones where like when we know that everyone is in a level playing field, everyone just has to play the game, play the mechanic. We can tune it accordingly so that it's hard but doable. We'd like to be able to do more of that for sure.
Yeah, I see the Firac first intermission, which was a private aura and then had to get hotfixed off of the private aura, as sort of a cautionary tale for if there's a mechanic that is only doable with the weak aura assignments, and then we take away that without giving an adequate replacement, then it's worse than doing nothing at all. What would a mechanic like that look like in a world where we don't have a computational solution to it, right? Would it be slower and fewer sets of like lower damage numbers on these things?
I think probably a bit of all of that. There's multiple knobs there. There's, on Mythic we might default to like everyone in today's world, everyone in the raid has to participate in this, and there's enough things to be soaked that if anyone isn't doing it, it's not going to work out. Versus
that's something that happens now, like you said. Like the thing that I can think of is seed soaks on Tindril, where you would get upwards of like 18 different seeds, and if one of them wasn't soaked, it was a wipe. So that's what they're trying to stray away from, because that's what they're sort of being pushed into doing now, and that's not something they want to do in the future.
Shifting to a world where there's a little bit more slush, things are a little bit slower, there's a little bit more time to react, to get into place organically based on which buff you were assigned, stuff like that. That at the end of the day, our goal here is to preserve challenge, and we know that we'd have to design encounters differently in some cases to deliver roughly the same level of challenge in terms of how many pull counts it takes, just what progression looks like, while living in a different mechanical world. And I know that when we talk about,
because they're talking about this now, this kind of leads me to believe that they're intending to take on this approach for Midnight. Because if they weren't planning to, adopt this sort of way of thinking until the last Titan, I don't think we'd be hearing about it yet. I think they're trying to at least, plant the seed in our mind now that, this is what the game is headed to become. So that's pretty exciting. We can start seeing some of these things even, yeah, maybe even in the next raid, potentially. That's very true. Maybe in the next raid, but at the very least, like next expansion, which is not that far away.
Restricting any kind of add-on functionality, many players very rightly, kind of reflexively say or ask, well, how am I supposed to do this boss in this tier without my weak aura? That would be impossible. And the reality is, if you couldn't use that weak aura, that mechanic would be designed or tuned differently. We would have ended up nerfing it right away or designing it differently over the course of even just PTR testing. And so that's like any future design in this space will have to be built from the ground up with that in mind. And I think it's making it a little bit more forgiving in a way that makes the challenge human rather than superhuman, as it often is when we're looking at like cutting edge mythic tuned things. Because I mean, you guys are really good at the game, as it turns out, and we want to make a boss that is going to pose a challenge and is going to take you dozens of attempts, let alone 100+ to beat. We do have to take into account the fact that not just you, but every mythic raid guild that's going to follow in your footsteps are going to be using these tools. And at the end of the day, I think players do want challenging bosses. That if we just tuned the boss around none of those things, players used all those tools, and they went in and like a late mythic boss was dying in a single night for like a cutting edge guild.
Sounds familiar.
500 or whatever. That probably doesn't match what they're looking to get out of mythic raiding. In my estimation. And so like our goal is to keep the same overall level of challenge while paring down the complexity a little bit.
Even if you look at the history of bosses this would have affected, you actually, even looking at Mythic Plus, something where the complexity has gone down from pack to pack in this patch, but the reality is you can still find challenge in it because it's infinitely scaling, and you will get to a point where it's doing too much damage to you, or the amount of damage you need to do is too high. There's been Mythic bosses that have been simple mechanically, but have been unbelievably difficult, and that's been true all the way down the guild ranks. It's not something that's just nerfed by gear.
Sludge Fist.
Sludge Fist, Kai
Great
Veza,
example.
where you've created really
Kai Veza is probably one of the best fights that we've had in years. Nexus Princess Kai Veza is a sick fight. On Mythic. On Normal and Heroic, it kind of got trivialized, but dude, Mythic Kai Veza was so much fun to prog.
intricate problems to solve where weak auras basically didn't matter. Halandris, you actually put a bomb timer very clearly in the game.
Halandris, great example
you did
again.
not need a weak aura for one of the hardest bosses ever, right? It's more just basically the solution for these weak auras has been just a very specific kind of assignment mechanic that is just like, oh, it's just so much easier to do this, right? You could build in a lot of that computational stuff in game to where even if weak auras existed, you would find people just being like, I don't know, the game just kind of does it. We have players that don't use audio sounds in weak aura packs because on bosses like Skarn, on most other bosses, there's like either an in-game sound for when the bombs are actually activating or a voice line. We have 2 players in our guild that use very minimal weak auras, and they literally listen to voice lines for when mechanics are going to happen, and it's extreme.
And by voice line, he means the actual like boss voice line. So when you like go into your audio settings in game and the options, you have the dialogue slider. If you turn that up to 100%, you'll hear the voice lines of these bosses so much clearer, and a lot of them coincide with mechanics when they're happening. I'm not saying you should do this, because it can be a little annoying, and it doesn't always work. But it's definitely something you can do, and it is something you can rely on if that's like your preferred way, I guess.
Extremely accurate, right? So I think a lot of these things are already built into the baseline game. It's just about choosing like when and how to apply them.
Absolutely. And yeah, I think your example, going back to Nathri of Sludge Fist, I think is a great one, right? Like a lot of that was just practice and just learning like how to react to these situations when chained to different partners and dodging the stuff. And people were in enough situations over enough time, they kind of develop that muscle memory, that sense of planning, and eventually your guild as a whole overcomes the challenge.
It's all repetition.
We'll say the Stone Legion generals that came after it, a couple of issues there, but like one of the central mechanics that was being solved by weak auras was like, all right, there's a whole bunch of soaks that need to be covered over the course of the fight, and it's not realistic to have that like 7 to 8 soaks up simultaneously, where you need to also account for like, well, this person just got targeted by different mechanics, so they need a backup to go in and do it for them.
Yeah, so it sounds initially like it's, we're restricting what add-ons can do, but really we're opening up the universe of mechanics that can exist in a WoW boss without, Because there are so many that you could think of right now where all of them would be, this is going to get solved by this, right? This is going to get solved by this. But if that's not the answer, then now the designers have all these tools back, and we can get these mechanics that maybe haven't been used since MOP because we've been weak-oring them ever since, and now we get to solve them with our brains again.
And he even mentioned too, he said like, well, there's a lot of swirlies now.
Yeah.
Because that's the thing, like, oh, we can always default to this and a few other things because you know you're not going to solve that with weaker, so we can add fights where that's not a thing. But you remove that, that friction of there's too many swirlies goes away. And I think there's assignment, like doing a lot of these assignment bosses without a weak aura that could work would be like really fun. Like it's fun to do that. It's fun when you have 5 people that need to soak something, like the last phase of Gallywix. There's a frontal on a side of a room, and 2 people die. And right now, weak aura is just like, okay, well then we're going to sign backup. So these 2 people get a big green thing on their screen, go soak that. That is something where that fight is spread out enough where you could actually communicate that. We need 2 people on the right to back up because 2 soakers are dead. Who can do it? This person says something, this person says something. Now, obviously, you're not going to have that kind of communication like heroic and normal. Maybe it won't be in comms, whatever, but in Mythic, that's perfectly reasonable, right? A lot of the things, like we could probably count, honestly, on 1, maybe 2 hands over the last like 4 or 5 years, how many bosses would you meaningfully would have to have a mechanic change. But they're very impactful, very memorable, and they have been purely defined by that. Are you worried at all about the communities? And this has certainly been ramping up over time. Like you mentioned, even for us, we were much more just do the mechanic 4 or 5 years ago than we are now. Are you worried that there has been this built-in reliance on it that might be hard to shake when creating new raid bosses?
It's a good point.
Absolutely. And I think that some of that.
I think that's true. I think it is going to be a concern at the start that the vast player base of people who do raiding, even do Mythic Plus, have gotten to a point where we are so reliant on these external weak auras or add-ons telling us the information, not even just telling us the information, but telling us what to do, that once that's kind of stripped away, and we have to use our brains a little bit more, we have to maybe look at the information and then decide what to do, rather than having the information in front of us and also being told what to do. I think you'll see a shift in like how players perform, who stands out in raid, who doesn't. It's going to be a bit of a learning curve, I think, and a period of adjustment for a lot of people. But I think, again, it's for the best. This is for the better health of the game. And dude, I'm really, really excited to see what this turns into, because as of right now, like I've been saying for a little while, like raiding just hasn't felt all that fun to me. But if there's going to be more mechanics involved in raiding that just feel more rewarding to do, maybe that could reignite my, I don't want to say my passion for raiding, because I don't know if I have a passion for it, but, reignite my excitement to be there every night.
That gets back to us knowing that we need to really ease into this, that any world where we just kind of rip the Band-Aid off and say, all right, have fun,
honestly,
we're in a new world, as opposed to, building up more built-in functionality, starting to have clearer visuals, simplify some mechanics, and then building counters and to have classes designed around a world where we know that this isn't possible. As long as people are set up for success, I think we'll be fine. Certainly, if we were to disable any functionality and then players went into a new tier and we're just wiping to bosses and they used to clear heroic comfortably and now they're brick walled,
just a clusterfuck.
Heroic. Yeah, players that would be a source of tremendous frustration. But we know that we need to avoid that by any means possible, and we have a lot of work to do before we get there.
Something that really encourages me is the ping system. That seems like such a perfect way to give us an option to identify where we're going, right? You can just ping where you're going, and then you don't have to, try and communicate with words. Hey, I'm going to move over to the left 20 yards, right? I just ping where I'm going, and that opens up an ability to solve these, again, in a YOLO style, right? Rather than an assignment.
I think your guild did that.
Yeah.
So the Echo of Neltharion, right?
Yeah, we just pinged it.
Yeah, so famously, everyone had the maps for that. Here's your exact spot you go, and then his guild was like, you know what, everyone just ping your spot. Mostly it gets covered. People go to the same spot every pull. But if you see 2 pings in a spot, 1 person has to move, right? And that could largely solve a mechanic with just something that's already built into the game.
Yeah.
As long as you still have enough time after you notice 2 people are in the same spot or 2 people have pinged, as long as you still have enough time to readjust and someone else moves to another spot. If you don't have enough time, that's when a weak aura becomes 100% necessary.
Yeah, I think and the ping system is something we've also talked about looking to improve and to like kind of broaden the sorts of things you can do with it to give people more tools to solve these problems in a coordinated way, but using their own skill and expression instead of another tool.
When I think of World of Warcraft, I'm always thinking back to when I first started playing the game, and there was this really exciting moment where I looked at it and I'm like, oh my god, I can make this game look however I want, right? Like I can put this here, I can have an add-on that tells me what time it is in London, what time it is in Darnassus, right? I can have all the world clocks there if I want. I can have 3 different bars at the bottom of my screen. I can do whatever I want there, and to me that's always been a strength, not a weakness of WoW. So I think there's a lot of people that disagree with me on that, but then there's also people that they hear about Blizzard thinking about restricting add-ons and they're worried about losing that. Is there any intention to go after any of that kind of customization?
Not whatsoever. And in fact, we're doing everything we can to, and we would do everything we can down the line to minimize any collateral damage to them. But the goal is anything that's cosmetic should be completely fair game. All informational stuff that's out of combat, like again, you have RP add-ons, help things that are tracking, helping with professions, tracking gathering nodes, helping you with quests, like you name it, a bunch of accessibility add-ons, all of those, like there's nothing harmful whatsoever about any of them. The only thing is at the very end of the day, once we feel like we've done enough on our end to improve baseline functionality, what we'd be looking at is the ability to parse real-time combat events in a way that drives, problem solving on the fly.
So it's kind of, we build the scaffolding to then be able to take away the existing weak aura solutions that we have for these. How much of this is, so the thing that's excited me also about edit mode has been, it's so clearly based on what the community has learned over 20 years, right? It's like, oh, the community has revolved around this as a solution for presenting this information. Let's give them that base in the UI rather than making them download something. How much of this initiative is still going to be based on what the community says, how the community reacts, versus which of these things are already kind of locked in decisions?
I'd say basically nothing here is locked in.
Okay.
Really, my hope today is to kind of begin a conversation about that direction and what areas are welcome, what areas maybe have more to do to convince the community on, and what areas we might be wrong on and should, reconsider. Because I think at the end of the day,
it's good
this
that
game
they're open.
belongs first and foremost to our millions of players. We're trying to serve them as best we can in the long run. And I think our sense is that for many players, the feeling that they have to download and use certain add-ons in order to play the game competitively isn't really part of what's attractive about the game or healthy in the long run. And so if we can pull things back to a place where add-ons are available for those who want to use them, but people aren't feeling pressured by their groups, by just the natural demands of competition and not wanting to lose out to someone who's using more advantages, then that's going to be the healthier route in the long run.
So if I was the kind of person who wanted to write a 10-paragraph forum manifesto, this would be one of the topics to do it on, right?
Absolutely. We'll be reading, we'll be listening. I think this is a long path ahead. And yeah, just, curious to kick off the conversation and hear how people feel about it. So Rotation Assist is coming in 11.1.7, which is going to be hitting the PTR in the very near future. Can't wait to hear people's feedback as they're able to hop on and check it out. We'll be listening closely so we can make it the best it can be for everybody. It's also been amazing to just get a chance to talk through kind of the history of add-ons in WoW, where they are today, and where they might be going in the future. Thank you guys for coming out. It's really been a pleasure.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us here. Really looking forward to see what the community has to say about how much they want more of these casts, maybe monthly, maybe bi-weekly, weekly, whatever you guys think, put it in the comments.
Daily. Just
daily, and you said it, it's not me. Thank you so much, Liz. This has been really, really awesome.
So I think it's super important to acknowledge that they did an interview like this. This doesn't happen. What this is right here, this has never happened. This has been a full production, 43-minute interview with Ian. That, obviously was probably a little bit scripted, but they didn't avoid answering the tough questions. Usually, especially with interviews with Ian, it's very, very on rails. They only cater to questions that are positive and in a good light and, not asking the hardball questions. But in this one, they absolutely did. And dude, it's it's good to see that the communication between the community and the devs is improving. It is improving. There's still a lot of work to be done. You know, a lot of, I think, smaller things could be better, like, you know, acknowledging that there might be bugs in the game when the bugs are there, telling us that they're working on them, maybe telling us why the bugs happened. I get that some of that information isn't necessary. Sometimes the player doesn't really need to know that, but even just acknowledging that the bug is there and saying like, hey, we see it, we're working on it. That would be more than enough for me. But yeah, this is great. I'm really excited that they're starting to make these changes in the game and that they have a vision for the future, because this type of thing is what makes me excited for the future. If we were going to have another expansion ahead of us, if Midnight was just going to be another War Within, I don't know if I'd be that excited. Like, it's the same thing in a different coat of paint. But this gives me hope that the feel of the game, the challenge of the game, the reward and the satisfaction that I get from playing in all different types of content is hopefully going to improve. So really looking forward to this. And yeah, let's go on to the PTR and check out the actual rotation assist now.